Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 3 of the preseason for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Anaheim Ducks once again, but this time managed to win by a score of 3-2 in overtime. Now, it seemed as though the Sharks would actually have their hands full with what the Ducks were bringing out here tonight, and this goes back to what I mentioned about not being able to take preseason results too seriously, which is that the Sharks came out with a relatively inexperienced roster. The only established top 6 player that they had in their lineup was William Eklund. The rest of their top 6 was either players like Dellandrea, Sturm, and Kostin, who are more bottom 6 guys, or players like Musty and Kostin, who aren't even necessarily NHL caliber. On the other hand, you have the roster that the Ducks brought in, which featured a top 6 of players like Mason McTavish, Troy Terry, Leo Carlsson, Trevor Zegras, Alex Killorn, Cutter Gauthier, guys who are capable of or have already scored 60+ points in the NHL. And if the Ducks were to head into next season with those players making up their top 6, I'm not sure too many people would bat an eye. So it seemed as though, roster-wise on paper, the Ducks would be able to skate circles around the San Jose Sharks, but that didn't actually end up happening, and it goes back to the other reason for why I've said you cannot necessarily take preseason results super seriously, which is the sense that a lot of established players don't really take these exhibition games all that seriously at all. And so that could be a major reason for why the San Jose Sharks were actually able to surprise come from behind victory in overtime against a significantly stronger Ducks roster. With that being said, as I mentioned, these games are technically meaningless in the sense that they don't actually give a tangible advantage in the standings for the Sharks, but considering all of the players here in the NHL are likely very hyper-competitive, that's really one of the major ways they were able to get to this level, getting a victory is obviously much preferred than actually having a loss, and so it is still a nice little boost of confidence to the Sharks roster. With that being said, the next point that I want to bring up before we actually get to talking about this game is the fact that with this one being finished, it marks the halfway mark of the preseason. Over the first 3 games, there was significant turnover in the Sharks roster. It felt as though from one game to the next, pretty much every single player would get swapped out and swapped in. However, the next game, Game 4, takes place only on Tuesday. There is a large gap between these games, and if I had to guess, there will likely be some pretty significant training camp cuts coming over these next few days, which means we will likely have significantly more stability in the Sharks roster from a game-to-game basis over the last 3 games of the preseason. Likely the only players who are sticking around will either be the locks of the team, Eklund, Toffoli, Granlund, these types of guys. The players who are more borderline and could make that roster, like a Kostin or a Gushchin, or the players who the Sharks would really want to keep a very close eye on and get maybe an extra game or 2 in there, like a Luca Cagnoni. Otherwise, most of the other names that we have been seeing over these last few days probably going to end up getting sent back either to their respective junior leagues or down to the San Jose Barracuda for their training camp. With that being said, let us jump over to what we actually saw here tonight against Anaheim, and we'll start off with the Sharks top line featuring William Eklund. As I said, he was on paper the Sharks' best player of the night, the only top 6 guy, at least expected to be top 6 guy going into the next season here, and I think Eklund would probably be the first player to admit that these couple of preseason games that he has played haven't necessarily been his best. He certainly hasn't looked all that fantastic, but as it goes back to something that I mentioned just a bit earlier on in this video, these established players don't really take these exhibition games all that seriously, and so it is not all that surprising that Eklund is not coming in here at his 100% best. And I will still say Eklund is a good enough player that even not playing all that great here tonight, he was still one of the Sharks' better forwards. He was still creating plays. He was still effective on the Sharks' power play, lost the puck a couple of times, still some shakier moments, but it's not something that really impacts my idea for how well he's going to end up playing through the regular season. In 3 to 4 months' time, we're not going to be looking back and saying, well, Eklund didn't have a very good preseason. We're going to be saying, wow, look how great Eklund is actually playing in the regular season. So to me, this isn't necessarily some sort of bad omen heading into next year. Even if you would have liked to see Eklund play better, he has still been decent enough, and this game was no different. When it comes to Ty Dellandrea, the center of this first line, this was definitely a bit of a surprise to see. The San Jose Sharks have some pretty good center depth, and so it is quite unlikely that Dellandrea is actually going to be able to play in this position next season when he has the likes of Granlund, Celebrini, Wenberg, Will Smith, Nico Sturm all above him for that particular role in the depth charts. He's likely to find himself more so as a winger, but it is possible that Warsofsky wanted to see what he could get out of Dellandrea in this role, and I thought Dellandrea looked decent enough as the center of this first line. He was brought in to be more so a reliable bottom six, two-way type of guy, and while there may have been some hope in the back of Mike Greer's mind that he could tap into some of that first-round potential that he does have and actually find a certain offensive game, kind of like the hope the Sharks had with Philip Zadina last year, there really wasn't a lot that I saw here tonight that made me think he had a very high offensive ceiling. Again, he was just kind of doing some decent things defensively for the Sharks, but offensively, there wasn't a ton that I managed to see. When it comes to the third player on this line, we had Kasper Halttunen. So he got a try with William Eklund, which is a very nice advantage for a young player. And I thought Halttunen actually looked pretty solid on the game. He did not have a very good outing at the Rookie Faceoff Tournament a couple of weeks ago, which kind of, I feel like, hurt his chances of being able to make his professional debut with the San Jose Barracuda, because he does have that option available to him, either Barracuda or back to juniors. This game was a nice little argument the other way to show that perhaps he is ready, as I do think he looked rather okay throughout the night. But at the same time, there were still a couple of issues. There was this one terrible pass back in the first period on a Sharks power play that almost led to a goal against. That's something that you definitely want to be able to eliminate from his game. And if I was still having to sort of give my answer, I would lean more so towards him heading back to the OHL, especially since he would be joining another Sharks prospect, Sam Dickinson, there. So I don't know how much of an impact this game actually had, but at the very least, it was a decent outing for him. Then we get to Sharks prospect Quentin Musty. You know, Musty played a preseason game already this season, and in that one, he was not very good. But I had mentioned that I would have liked to see him with more talented individuals on his line, you know, playing with a Celebrini and a Tyler Toffoli. Well, here tonight, we didn't actually get that. Instead, he gets paired once again with more fourth-line-esque players like Nico Sturm and Klim Kostin. But it should be noted that that can't necessarily be the end-all, be-all excuse for Quentin Musty. As I mentioned the other night with Will Smith, at a point you have to take a bit of individual responsibility. Sure, if you're playing with not the best players, you might not be able to generate a ton of points for yourself, but you can still look good individually on the ice. And I don't think Musty managed to actually achieve that. Through the juniors, he's able to be fast enough to be a couple of steps ahead of the play, but in the increased speed and intensity and skill at the NHL level, instead, Musty just looks a step behind. He's not able to react correctly to a lot of these plays. He just looks a little bit slow, not necessarily skating wise, but just being able to process the game at an incredibly high speed. So I think there is definitely more seasoning that needs to be done. Obviously, we'd love for Musty to be able to head to the San Jose Barracuda instead. Unfortunately, that's not the case, so he will have to head back to juniors, but that does seem to be in the cards for Musty at this point. Maybe he survives the next round of cuts and the Sharks want to give him yet another preseason game, but it would take a miracle for him to actually be able to make enough of an impact to actually make it to the Sharks roster. The thing with Musty is that there hasn't really been a lot working offensively, and usually a coach will tell a player in that case to try to simplify their game. Oh, we'll just dump pucks in, go on the forecheck, things will end up working itself out. But for Musty, it almost feels as though he's kind of trying to do too much by himself because of the fact that he knows he needs to make that major impact if he wants to be able to make the team out of camp, and it just hasn't been working out. We saw him try to go for like a between the legs pass this game. That didn't end up working out. He tried to weave through multiple times these Ducks defensemen. That didn't end up working out. It's just they're kind of bashing your head against the wall almost if you're Quentin Musty, and just not a lot of positive results. When it comes to his two line mates, we had Nico Sturm, kind of like with Ty Dellandrea, a player who you're not expecting the biggest offensive ceiling out of. Sturm, I thought, was decent enough defensively here tonight, but there really isn't all that much else to say. And then we get to Kostin. His first preseason game was on a very talented line. He found himself with Celebrini and Toffoli, and so while he was pretty good in that one, I had mentioned I'd rather see him with more like third to fourth line caliber players to see how he performs in that area. And that's exactly what we actually ended up getting here tonight, playing with Sturm and Musty. And for the first couple of periods, it did not go well for Kostin at all. He was rather invisible and really not making anything happen. So much so that Warsofsky decided to send him a message by actually demoting him from the first power play unit to the second power play unit as a swap with Danil Gushchin. And it ended up being a message that Kostin responded to very well. His third period was far and away his best one of the game. He made some things happen on the power play, including the goal that actually tied this game up at 2. He had a very dominant shift as well in the third period where he was able to protect the puck exceptionally well. And then that carried into the overtime where he was a big reason for why the Sharks actually ended up getting this game-winning goal by being able to use his body to protect the puck against the much more tired Anaheim Ducks defenders that eventually, as I said, led to the Cagnoni game winner. So it was a nice little finish for Kostin, who started this game off very, very poorly. So I was ready to come in here and say, well, Kostin may have just blown his chance of being able to make it to the NHL roster for game 1, but he redeemed himself near the end. That still leaves him in the running. Then we get to the third line, and of course, we have to start off with Danil Gushchin. The other day, Game 2, I talked about how Gushchin was one of the best players on the ice, and he was actually the player I had on the thumbnail for that video. Well, here today, it wasn't even close this time. Danil Gushchin was far and away, above all everybody else, the best player on the ice for the San Jose Sharks. It was not close, even remotely so. And it kind of ties into what I said about Quentin Musty. You don't necessarily have to be playing with the best of the best players to actually look good as an individual on the ice. You see, Gushchin here is playing with Colin White and Ethan Cardwell, and as much of a fan I am of Ethan Cardwell, it's unlikely either of these players are going to be making it to the NHL for this upcoming season. And yet, Gushchin still elevates those two players, makes them look significantly better, and he himself was so fantastic. It felt as though every single shift he was incredibly dominant. His play on the power play was very, very impressive. He was able to create chances out of nothing. He was finding the soft spots on the ice to be able to receive these dangerous passes. There was a particular play where Cardwell goes for a backhand pass to Gushchin, and you're thinking like, oh, this is a pass that's going to handcuff him, not much is going to come from it, and yet he was able to kind of stick handle in a phone booth, so to speak, and actually get this shot off. It goes off the crossbar, then the post, inches of being a goal for Gushchin, a play that you really didn't think he'd be able to pull off, and yet he had the skill to do it. So to me, this seems like the easiest and most obvious inclusion at this point to the Sharks main roster this season. He should be able to make the roster out of training camp with these two incredible performances he has had. He's been far and away the Sharks' best player over the entire preseason. It would be a major snub for him to not be able to make it, and it's just, there isn't really much else to say. He's just been that good. When it comes to the other two players on his line, as I said, they were both elevated simply by the presence of Gushchin with them. Colin White was on the fourth line last game for the Sharks. He didn't really show much besides speed, but here tonight he actually made some decent things happen offensively. Was perhaps the weak link of the line, but that's not saying much because I think Gushchin and Cardwell were just that good, and so Colin White being slightly below that is technically the worst of the three, but still solid. So that was a nice little game for Colin White for sure. And then when it comes to Cardwell, we know that Cardwell and Gushchin already have some decent chemistry, considering the fact that they played pretty much the entirety of last season with the San Jose Barracuda together, even if they weren't necessarily always on the same line. But we really got to see that chemistry in action here tonight. They both looked so good off playing off of each other. Really, really impressive. Cardwell created that first goal by being able to win the battle along the boards to make that pass happen. He, like with Colin White, had played a game in the preseason already on the fourth line and didn't really show much, but here on a more offensive line with a player like Danil Gushchin, he absolutely managed to shine. Then we get to the fourth line. We feature Giovanni Smith, Tristan Robbins, Brandon Coe. As has been the case for the last couple of games, fourth lines for the Sharks, they didn't really end up showing much. Tristan Robbins did technically score, but this was kind of in the middle of a line change. He ended up getting the beneficiaries of both Gushchin and Cardwell, so not even technically a fourth line goal, so to speak. And otherwise, at even strength, Robbins didn't really do much. Technically, I will say, he also didn't do much bad for the team either. Him and Giovanni Smith, I thought in the end, I guess, were like relatively average, but Brandon Coe was probably someone who stood out in a pretty bad way. I thought he got chances on the second power play unit where I thought he was a complete disaster. One of the major reasons for why at times that those power play units could look a little bit lost. And even at even strength, besides some okay speed, it felt as though Coe really didn't make much happen and was kind of a bit of an issue on the ice from actually being able to create offense. So he's another player who's kind of part of the old parts of the San Jose Sharks, the Doug Wilson parts for them, not so much the Mike Greer parts. And it feels as though with the very little progress that he has made with the San Jose Barracuda over these last couple of years, I'm not sure really where Brandon Coe stands with the organization, probably quite low on the depth charts. When it comes defensively, we have the top pairing of Furlong and Benning. Both of these players actually making their preseason debut. Benning is an interesting one to watch because it's a big question mark how his health is actually going to carry over into the regular season. And I thought he looked rather solid. Offensively, there wasn't much happening for Matt Benning, which is really not that much of a surprise because he's not that type of player. But defensively, I thought he was quite good. And even though this is technically preseason, it should still be considered that the Ducks were icing a very competitive lineup, at least when it comes to their forward group. And so Benning did a pretty good job at managing to shut those players down. But really who stood out for me was actually Jake Furlong. Benning, if he is healthy, you're expecting decent defensive play, but Furlong is still that young player who's kind of forgotten a bit within the San Jose Sharks defensive depth charts. You talk of Dickinson, you talk of Cagnoni, you talk of Mukamadulin, of Thrun, these types of players. You don't really mention Furlong all that much, but he's had some really steady development over these last couple of years. I believe he was just on Team Canada at the World Juniors almost a year ago back in January. He was one of their better defensemen throughout that tournament. So he's been sort of chugging along here, getting better and better, and he's going to be an interesting player to keep an eye on over these next couple of years, what really comes of his game. Then we get to the second defensive pairing here. We have Sam Dickinson and Henry Thrun. I'll start with Dickinson. The good news is that he is better than what he showed in his first preseason game. The bad news is that that wasn't really a high bar to reach because Dickinson was really bad in his first preseason game. He was a turnover machine that night where every single time he touched the puck, you got nervous that he'd end up just giving it over to the other team. He was a couple of steps better than that, but the bad news I would still say is that it felt as though he was more of a negative force on the ice than a positive force for San Jose. It is quite clear above all else that there is still a lot of work to be done with this player. He's going to be heading back to juniors, back to the London Knights, and hopefully he can make some significant progress in improving in the areas that he does need to improve in, because there's a lot of them. When it comes to his defensive partner, Henry Thrun, I thought Thrun was okay, very up and down game. There were some shifts where he was looking rather solid, some shifts that were a bit more shaky. You could argue that maybe because he didn't have the most reliable defensive partner here tonight, that kind of had an effect. But perhaps you were maybe hoping for slightly better than from Thrun. Still, it's the preseason, can't be too hard on him. Then we get to the third defensive pairing for the Sharks. Here, of course, we have Luca Cagnoni, who has been a big surprise for the Sharks through the rookie faceoff tournament as well as the preseason. He's just gotten better and better as it has gone on, and tonight is no exception. Cagnoni was one of the better defensemen, if not the best defenseman. There's an argument to be made there on the night. All over the puck, I thought he was all over the ice and also all over the puck, I guess. He was making some decent moves offensively as well as some strong defensive play, at least in his own zone. If there is something that I would like to see him improve on is actually defending the rush, because while I think his zone defense is actually rather solid, his rush defense can be somewhat shaky, was victimized a couple of times, or at least came close to being victimized a couple of times here tonight, as well as back into his previous preseason game, and even going back to the rookie faceoff tournament. So definitely an area to improve on, but still it's been mostly positives for him. His role on the Sharks power play, he's looked very, very comfortable in that area, and just I have been so blown away by the type of progress that Cagnoni has made over these last couple of weeks. Should be a very big contributor for the San Jose Barracuda this season. And then when it comes to his defensive partner, Ethan Frisch, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, he's not the most notable name here, probably the least notable out of all of the Sharks defensemen on the night, and yet I also thought he had a pretty solid night. It was quite nice to see him. Perhaps he could be a nice little piece if he is going to be making it to the AHL team. And then finally we have the Sharks goaltender on the night, Romanov. I thought he looked really solid. today. As I mentioned earlier on, the Ducks icing a pretty competitive roster. These are some skilled players, some really, really strong scorers, even at the NHL level in the regular season. The fact that Romanov was able to stonewall most of them throughout this game was quite impressive. He let in the one goal to Leo Carlsson that I think he probably could have had, but the one to Mason McTavish he didn't really have much of a chance on. But the Sharks were outmatched, outgunned, and outshot here tonight. Romanov stood tall and was a pretty big reason for why the Sharks were able to secure this victory. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, like I said, on Tuesday. We are likely to see a lot of roster cuts over these next few days, and we shall see who survives and what kind of stability we can find in the Sharks roster. Class dismissed.